My name is Anna Ahlers. I'm head of the Lise Meitner Group, China and the Global System of Science. We are organizing lectures from time to time, and today it's our very great pleasure to have Joshua Freedman from the University of Pennsylvania with us. I came across your work when you gave a talk in the STS seminar at Harvard. I was joining virtually, and they do it in a webinar kind of setting where you see the speaker and you see the presentation, and I was immediately super hooked and fascinated by that, and I looked up your dissertation, but there wasn't a lot of interaction possible because I think the main focus for them is the room, understandably so. And so I thought, let's have another chance to interact, also including more people, our research group, but also anyone else from the interested public. And so we invited you and are very, very glad that you said yes and can join us, even though it's very early in the morning on your side. In Harvard, you presented one part of your dissertation research. I think it was a comparative study of Taiwan and China dealing with COVID-19. For us, you have chosen a more substantial theoretical or the conceptual part of your work, and we are very excited to learn more about it and look forward to your talk and the discussion. The usual Zoom etiquette applies. Please mute yourself. We'll have plenty of time for an interactive discussion at the end. We will record the lecture and make it publicly available later once Joshua has agreed to the recording or reviewed the recording, but will not record the Q&A part. Franziska Fröhlich, who is the organizer of this lecture, has prepared information about Joshua's academic background, which she'll share with us today and then and then she'll hand over to you. And in the end, we'll do a moderation of the Q&A. But for now, I'm very much looking forward to the talk. And thanks already so much for joining us today, Josh.
Thank you.
All right. I mean, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Joshua Freedman. Joshua is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania, as Anna already mentioned. And before joining UPenn, he was a visiting research associate at the Institute of Sinology of the Academia Sinica. And Joshua holds a PhD in government from Harvard University and a BA in public policy from Stanford University. And before joining Harvard to earn his doctorate, Joshua actually worked as a think tank policy analyst in Washington, D.C. and as a research manager in Beijing. So he has extensive experience also in China. Joshua is researching the intersection of politics, society, and ideas. And his current book project offers a new theory of scientific authority in contemporary society and shows how the authority of scientific experts shapes the underpinnings of the contemporary Chinese party state. Other ongoing research topics include the role of scientists in Taiwan's pandemic response, variations in the local political economic development in China, evolving Chinese views of the United States, and the comparative political theory of technocracy and populism. Joshua is a pretty prolific author, and his work has been published, among others, in the China Quarterly and China and International Journal. And in addition to his scholarly work, he contributes analysis, reportage, and opinion on the policy on politics in both the United States and China for public outlets, including Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, and Washington Monthly. Joshua, we are very much looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you so much, Franziska, and thank you, Anna. Thank you to the research group for inviting me. It's a very kind introduction. I think I should be more prolific. It's been a while. A lot of that is from my earlier work. And as everybody who has done a PhD knows, that really puts a damper on getting things done when you're stuck in the middle of it. So I'm very happy to be here at UPenn, and I'm very happy to share my work. I will add one more thing, which is in addition to writing for outlets, I do also write comedy. So if there are a couple bad jokes that are in here, I take full responsibility for those. The actual research content, I will also take responsibility for, but you know, take that or leave it. And so today I'm talking about one part of the larger project that Anna and Francesca mentioned, that I'm working on, which tries to integrate theories of science and society with sort of actual examples from contemporary China. And for this one, and this is partially because of the way the research unfolded, I'm looking at trying to tie together an ongoing campaign in China called the Spirit of Scientists campaign that you may have encountered at some point, but as far as I can tell, not that many people have looked at closely, with some broader ideas about the organization of science and how we think about the relationship between the party and scientists. This is a work in progress, so it is not a finished thing. So I'm very much looking forward to a discussion with all of you, and I of course welcome any feedback, both on the theoretical part and on any of the case study aspects that I present. I'll try not to talk for too long, so we have plenty of time for Q&A, and I really look forward to all feedback that you guys give, and I hope you get something out of the presentation. But let me figure out how to do this. All right, there we go. So it won't be a lot to convince everybody here that China has gone all in. Has gone all in on science and technology as part of its ongoing development strategy. In basically every major speech, whether the recent third plenum to basically any other speech that's been given in recent memory, science and technology, innovation, both basic research and applied research are at the center of all of it. And so in 2018, Xi Jinping gave a quote that says, "If China wants to be strong and prosperous, it must vigorously develop science technology. We are closer to the goal of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation anytime in history. Building a world science technology power must also come at this time of history." So this idea of science technology is about development, it's about rejuvenating the Chinese nation. It's all tied together. China wants to be a, quote, world leading scientific superpower by 2050. And, many of the famous phrases that we now see about scientific self-sufficiency, about new productive forces, about becoming a scientific superpower, this all is part of a general importance of science and technology to the project. But there's obviously a key underlying question here, which is, can China and can the party effectively promote science? And so one way of thinking about this, and I think this is especially the case in the dominant frameworks, at least in America, is that we tend to think that liberal systems or democratic systems are more likely to effectively promote innovation, science, technology, in part because they limit political interference. There are a lot of concerns about political interference. But we haven't really thought of or re-evaluated this since the sort of fall of the Soviet Union and the sort of most obvious alternate model fell apart. And so when people talk now about whether China can innovate or whether they can do science effectively, a lot of it relates to how much they've liberalized. But obviously right now, China is both undergoing a period of political tightening while also promoting science and technology. And so I think that this is a perfect time to reassess some of these bigger questions about China's ability to promote science technology and how they're going to do it. And then there's a question, sort of the more academic theoretical side, which is, what does bringing the example of China into this tell us about the dominant theories that we think of? So evaluating China's approach to science technology and how they think about the ways to promote it gives us a new angle for saying, how do these theories, which have been dominant for a long time, I'm going to talk especially about Robert Merton, how do they hold up in the contemporary era? And so there's a practical sense of this, which is, if we care about, the contemporary plausibility of China's development path and what's going on in terms of its attempt to become a science technology superpower, I think this is important. And of course, in terms of thinking about it from a perspective of science, the theories of science, this is also important. And I'm going to focus on what the party says and what the party views, in part because that is that sort of is an easier way to grasp onto it. I'm not saying that's the whole story here, but I do want to take seriously the party's vision of how it thinks it can do it. The question of whether it can actually do it is a much larger research project, one that I hope to also have some answers to in the future, but we'll put that aside for now. So the argument that I'm going to make in brief, I'm just going to lay this out here, is that, as I said, following Robert K. Merton, the dominant view of scientific behavior is that it's a function of liberal institutions which come from a self-regulating scientific community. I will lay this theory out. The failure of alternate approaches, especially the Soviet Union, has continued to keep this as the dominant framework. But the Chinese Communist Party does not accept this idea of the self-regulating scientific community. And I'm going to unpack where that comes from. As a result, instead of the self-regulating scientific community, the contemporary party has maintained and expanded this idea of the importance of cultivating the spirit of science or the spirit of scientists. It's that institutions alone are insufficient, and actually it requires a sort of moral molding or moral persuasion of the individual scientists themselves. And when we think about that in the context of Mertonian scientific frameworks, we do see a lot of overlaps in the party's current approach with some of the elements that we attribute to the ethos of science, the spirit of science, but especially on the idea of disinterestedness. There is a rejection there. And I think that's sort of the important key to think about when we're trying to evaluate what China is currently doing. So there's 4 parts to this talk. The first one, I'm going to talk about the theory, and this is a little theory heavy, so my apologies. I think my apologies, hopefully. It's not my apologies. I'm going to very briefly do the world's briefest history of thinking about some of this in the Chinese context, and then I'm going to get to some empirics from a case study of the ongoing campaign in China. So one of the sort of shared ideas, whether you're talking about early 20th century thinkers to now, is that there's something about a spirit of science. That when scientists are doing their work, there's some sort of attitude that matters. We think predominantly, say, of Max Weber and his very famous Vocation and Profession of Science, where he describes the ideal scientist. I mean, you know, the scientist is full of impersonality, humility, skepticism. While you're doing the science itself, it should be as value-free as possible. I mean, Weber also goes on to describe working in university as, you know, you don't get paid very much, all your colleagues are mediocre, all these things, and you're dedicated to this thing only to be surpassed. It's a very negative view of the profession, but if you're really dedicated to it, it is still worth it. Anyways, there's a sort of spirit of the scientist, a spirit of science that scientists embody when they do their work, that is important to have. And I'm saying this is not just something that we see in the West. These discussions were also happening, these ideas were also in China. I quote here from Zhu Kezhen, who was the president of Zhejiang University in the 1930s and 1940s, a meteorologist by training. And he wrote a famous speech called The Method and Spirit of Science, where he says, you know, the key aspects of doing science is that you should not blindly follow, you should be open-minded, you should seek truth from facts. That idea of seeking truth from facts, you know, 求是 became the motto of Zhejiang University. It also, of course, we see it in the contemporary party lexicon as part of 实事求是, as in seeking truth from practice, that the practice is the criterion of truth. And so this idea that there's some sort of spirit of science that's important pervades all of this. So then the question is, what is the connection between the spirit of scientists and how we organize or promote science in society? And so thinking about the broad spectrum of the potential ways of doing this, I sort of see 3 different ways, 3 different models, for example, where we can think about the relationship between the scientific spirit and the political order. And these are not hard and fast types. They're sort of categories that I want to use as a way of elucidating some of the differences. But we can think about these and hopefully unpack how they're different. The first one would be the idea that we see in the work of J.D. Bernal or the early communist thinkers that the spirit of science is reflected in the politics, and the politics can shape the science itself. The second one would be that there's the idea of what we might call scientific democrats, that the attitude of science itself should shape the politics, and that the spirit of science should be the founding ideas of the democratic order, and actually you need this scientific spirit in order to have a functioning democracy. We think of people like John Dewey as the largest expression of this, or his student in China, Hu Shi, who brought these sort of pragmatist ideas and was thinking about the importance of the scientific spirit and scientific attitude as the foundation for the possibility of democracy in China. And you see this now into the contemporary era with theorists like Yaron Ezrahi, who talks about the overlaps between science and liberal democracy and the importance of science as the potential foundations for creating a positive project of contemporary democracy. And then there's a third one, which is I would call the scientific liberals. And this is that the spirit of science is reflected in politics, but actually this means that science should regulate itself. And it's that it's not that science needs to shape the political order, but actually the political order should let science do its own thing. And I think the third one, which I'm going to focus on most, has become, or was for a long time, the dominant framework. So the first, just fleshing these out a little bit more deeply, the first one would be what we would see in what we think maybe early communist work, the idea of political values reflecting scientific values, thus politics can and should regulate science. In the communist project, we're thinking about this as rejecting individualism to serve a greater cause, that greater cause being a conscious ordering of the world, right? Science can and should have central planning so that the needs of the scientists are reflected in, the needs of politics are reflected in the way that science works. And because science is about community and collaboration, it's actually the case that, again, there's this reflection, but that planning can be good and actually bring out the spirit of scientists, the spirit of science, I'm sorry. In the Chinese case, there's a number of ways that this comes up. You know, the very famous rocket scientist Chen Xuesen, who will basically features in all of this as the key figure of the key hero of scientists. You know, in many of his works, he describes something like the proper way that science works is also the proper way that politics works, because, for example, the idea of democratic centralism, he talks about scientists should discuss, and then there should be an authoritative leader that comes and makes a decision based on the best evidence. That is the same as the communist idea of democratic centralism. Thus, there is another overlap there. So that's the sort of first way of potentially organizing this. The second way is the inverse, that the scientific spirit should be the basis of a democratic politics. We see this very strongly in the anti-fascist movements of the progressive movements of the early 20th century in both, and especially in America, but also in China. The idea of the spirit of science, as we saw with Zhu Kezhen, it's not just a method, it's not just a methodology, it's also an attitude. That attitude is the kind of attitude that would make for a functioning democratic society. So for John Dewey, he's very critical that scientists are just off in their labs doing their own things. Actually, they should be bringing these values to society. If all citizens embrace the scientific spirit, then you can actually have the functioning of a proper participatory democracy. Someone like Hu Shi in China had a similar view, the need for the spirit of science to be the foundation of liberal democracy. In the more modern world, we might think that the way of thinking about this is as a highly participatory democracy, where we think about ways of regulating that involve deference to citizens or citizen committees or some version of democracy regulating science, because we want to have the values of science expressed through the actual political order. And the third one, and this is where I'm going to concentrate, is the idea that the spirit of science, as it reflects the liberal democratic order, science should be left to regulate itself. So the broader social values give science the space to operate, but ultimately the values of science should perpetuate themselves. And so Robert Merton is the biggest or the most important proponent of this. Not that he's the first to come up with this, but that he sort of says it most clearly. There are norms, there are values. These are legitimated in terms of institutional values, right? It is not, these values end up, there's a reflection between the science and the political order, but what matters is that the scientific community, the scientific institutions themselves will generate these and protect them, right? And he calls it, he's on the same team as these sort of Democrats because he's arguing in the era where it's sort of pre-Cold War. He's trying to make a case for liberal democracy, but he also wants autonomy, right? He wants the scientists and the scientific community to be autonomous. And so he argues that actually this spirit of scientists is part of a way that the institutions of science will regulate themselves. So very famously, Merton has these 4 institutional qualities that are science, that are the ethos of science. So the first one, of course, is universalism, that scientific claims are subject to impersonal criteria. Science should not have national boundaries. Writing in the spirit of the war period, the early World War I, World War II period, this is very important, that, rejecting the idea that there's a Nazi science or an Aryan science or Jewish science, right? That there is just science and that these are subject to objective claims. We see this idea of communalism or communism, and here we see an overlap between Bernal and the communist theorists and what happens in Merton's ethos, that science is a collective pursuit. It's not an individual pursuit. It requires collaboration. It requires the sharing of ideas. The third one is disinterestedness, which is that scientists are not working on behalf of political projects or economic projects. They're working only on behalf of the project of science. And I'm going to talk a lot more about this in a second. And the last one is organized skepticism. Science requires questioning authority. I think that's pretty widely agreed upon, no matter who you ask, that there's a sense that that is an important aspect of science. Whoops. And so this idea of disinterestedness, I think, is the most important because he's really focusing on the fact that this is institutions. The scientific community, the scientific institutions, this is not about individuals. So he quotes the sociologist Talcott Parsons and says, this is institutional, it's not motivational, right? In other words, that there's nothing special about the scientists themselves. The spirit of scientists, the attitude, the ethos does not reside in the individual scientists. It resides in the institutions. If the scientific community is properly structured, the scientists will embody this spirit of science. It will be a self-perpetuating role. There's a very good quote from, I think it's from Steven Pinker, who says, the old notion of the scientist as a hero has been replaced by this idea of scientists as amoral nerds at best, right? That it doesn't matter your virtues, your personal ideas, you're an ordinary person. If you're in the right institutions, you will end up embodying the proper spirit of science. And Michael Polanyi then takes this a step further by saying this is a parallel to the way that the free market works. You can see that if everybody's, there's just a bunch of actors doing the things in their own self-interest, there's nothing particularly virtuous about the economic actor in Adam Smith's Invisible Hand. But if it's properly organized, institutionally organized, you will get the maximal, science will do its best, right? And he's very strongly going against central planning because he thinks that central planning will end up only harming science rather than allowing it to produce reality. You cannot shape science. You can only kill or mutilate it unless you leave it alone. And so what you're left with here is this sort of dominant framework where there's a scientific community, it is self-regulating, and it embodies these characteristics that Merton lays out, and we've sort of come to see that as the predominant way of thinking, especially when the alternative, which would be the Soviet Union version, sort of has failed. And the most obvious question, the obvious example that of excessive political intervention in science was the case of Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union, where the agrobiologist Trofim Lysenko was had the backing of the party. As a result, the scientific genetic community was sidelined, or worse. And ultimately, obviously, his ideas of wheat combination, of vernalization, all of these did not end up working. But because they were backed politically and said that this is in line with the political order, it really set back Soviet genetics, and was a sort of, I would say, a victory for the dominant frameworks that actually excessive political intervention in the scientific community will end up leading to worse results. And just put a picture here of the 1956 Qingdao Conference on Genetics, because China had its own Lysenko experience, of course, where so heavily influenced by the Soviet Union in the early 1950s. There was similar debates happening until they got past it a little bit quicker than Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union fell apart. And so, with all that in mind, with that very complicated theoretical framework in mind, I want to talk a little bit about the Chinese context and how these ideas are fitting into the broader shape here. And so both the Soviet Union, which I just mentioned, and China have struggled throughout their time to figure out how to balance between a desire for party control and a need for deference to experts. This is the classic question. Any sort of revolutionary regime encounters this. In the early years, most of the intellectuals, most of the scientists were not going to be part of the revolutionary classes. They were from the established intellectual classes. The political leaders know that they want the power of science and technology, but they also want to make sure it serves the correct political ends. And so both China and the Soviet Union were struggling to balance between what ended up being called this idea of red and expert. So how do you balance between red and expert? Well, one of the goals is to create both scientists and cadres and citizens who embody both. And so what is redness and expertise? Red means being politically correct, having the correct political stance, loyalty to the party, against individualism, serving the needs of the state. It's upholding the party's leadership. And of course, at the very least, being willing to cooperate with the party. Being expert means being technically proficient. So using your scientific skills maximally. The ultimate goal, of course, is to be both. And for example, in a speech in 1961, Nie Rongzhen sort of explained what this is. Like, they require that scientists, protect party leadership, protect socialism, use their knowledge to serve socialism. But actually, it's also a two-way street, that by being red, you can also ultimately be more expert. Having the right motivations, having the right political consciousness will lead you to do better research. It will lead you to know what you should be doing. It's not an impediment. And actually, in an ideal world, the redness and expertise will be mutually constructive. But of course, in reality, it's not so easy. At many times, these are very much at odds, and China has oscillated between emphasizing the red and emphasizing the expert. So in the early years of the PRC, before the 100 Flowers campaign in 1956-57, there was a bunch of efforts at thought reform to change intellectuals. That was relaxed a little bit in the 100 Flowers campaign. So in 1957, Mao talks about, there's intellectuals want to be part of the socialist system. They're just not there yet. They can be remolded. They're capable of being remolded, but we have to be gradual. We have to go gradually and help them remold. We don't need to be heavy-handed, but we can get them to be read and expert. That turned out to not be very successful, and it was followed by the anti-rightist campaign and the Great Leap Forward, where this read and expert became basically read and not very expert. There was a much stronger and more violent way of trying to do this. That was then followed in the 1960s, before the Cultural Revolution, by, again, a reversion to trying to cultivate redness and expertise in a gradual way. And then, of course, the Cultural Revolution was much more violently and aggressively an attempt to remold. Anyways, it goes back and forth. But the key point here is that the range is from sort of a light amount of red to a heavy amount of red. But there's at no point in this process did they give up on the idea of redness and expertise being an important combination, right? Even in the periods where expertise is prioritized, when 1978, when it's very clear that expert is well read, there's still an emphasis that there has to be some elements of this political loyalty, this political position that work. And I think this continues to the contemporary era. We see, just jumping ahead to Hu Jintao's period, the way that he talks about science, he talks about the need for a patriotic spirit. He talks about this idea of, the scientific spirit of seeking truth. He talks about the exploratory spirit of fearlessness, innovation. He talks about collaboration. He's talking about both, many of these ideas that we see in Merton, and also this idea that there should still be some redness in there. And I bring up Hu Jintao here because this sort of sets the stage for the contemporary spirit of scientists campaign under Xi Jinping, which these sort of ideas are very much present in just a much more formalized and well thought out form in the current campaign. But you can see there's sort of a through spirit where all of these are not new. These are sort of always in the water, coming around. And so when we're thinking about the current approach to promoting science, there's obviously two ways to shape science. One is, figuring out how to organize the institutions. China, as the party leaders have very clearly identified, has issues with academic fraud, with people making up grants, abuse, taking credit for papers that they're not working on. These are all in the policy documents themselves where they identify this and want to fix it. And some of this involves putting in place the proper institutions, changing the incentives, changing the rules. But that's only part of it. And I think that even though that's the part that most people focus on, the other side is also important. And that is the idea of trying to cultivate a change in the attitudes of scientists themselves, which is embodied in a propaganda campaign, which is here the spirit of scientists. And you can tell the importance of this from the quote from Xi Jinping, where he says all the time, and this appears in most documents, that the scientific achievements are inseparable from spiritual support. So it is not just an institutional fix. It is very much something that has to come from shaping the spirit of science. And so where did the Spirit of Scientists campaign come from? Well, it actually has its origins in a project from 2010, which was a grant or a project grant received by the Chinese Association of Science and Technology, or spearheaded by them, to collect all kinds of oral histories and documents from elderly scientists. They realized that all these scientists were nearing the age at which they might pass away. They wanted to sort of get as much of this history as they could before it was too late. And so they started collecting papers, interviews, doing oral histories. It is now more than 700 scientists that they've worked on. And after starting in 2010, around 2013, 2014, there was a public showing of the results of this, which involved displaying these materials and sharing the stories of these scientists. And part of what happened was this was very popular. This seemed like a good idea, and it fit into, at the time, this idea of trying to promote science. And so it went from to a generic oral history project to the foundations of a much larger propaganda campaign. So in June 2019, the General Office of the Party and the State Council released a circular promoting the spirit of scientists, which laid out the core values, which I'll talk about. And that is sort of the codification of these ideas that have generated from this oral history project to the needs of the education campaign. And since then, it's basically appeared in every item about science that has come across. And Xi's big speech in Summer 2020, a big section of it is devoted to the spirit of scientists. And it's percolated down into a very large number of activities. There's museums, memorial halls, turning old scientists' homes into exhibits. There's a bunch of different traveling plays, lectures, educational activities. The education one's especially important. Scientists go to schools and give talks to try to promote these spirits. This is part of the new version of science popularization, or Kupu, in China. And I can personally attest that these are really everywhere, because I went to go visit a professor. This was in January or December 2023, January 2024. Visit a professor at Zhejiang University to talk about research. And literally right next to her office was a Spirit of Scientists exhibition hall. I was not looking for it, but it was there. And of course, because this was Zhejiang University, it was all about Zhejiang scientists. You can see these are pictures I took. So you can see the sort of layout here, and all around are these profiles of these different scientists who embody the spirit of scientists. Obviously, the one I highlighted here is Zhu Kejun, as I mentioned earlier, the former president of Zhejiang University. And the quote up top is all about, don't blindly follow, don't just be obedient. Everything comes back to rationality. So it's these ideas of promoting the spirit of scientists. And as I said, this is there are now hundreds and hundreds of these exhibitions or various bases around China to promote the physical manifestation of promoting these ideas. Most prominently, they just opened a new national museum for the modern Chinese scientist. I wanted to go, but it wasn't open when I was last there in China, so I had to delay my invitation to go. But this is again the public presentation of the version of these items that they've collected and trying to promote this spirit of scientists. So I went and looked through a lot of these materials. So I went through, there's a whole 6-volume book series on the spirit of scientists published by the Science Technology Press. That is the official compendium of some of these scientists, which features a lot of these profiles. There's a companion series in People's Daily, also sponsored by the Association of Science and Technology, that features a lot more of these profiles. And then, of course, policy documents, speeches, and other forms. This is not a comprehensive, there's no way to be comprehensive because it's always changing, it's always expanding. But because these are once you look at enough of them, you can sort of take out the sense, you can get the sense of what is being emphasized and how it works. And again, although I'm going to say this is not comprehensive, I looked at enough of these that you can sort of get a sense of some patterns, right? So this is, how old are these scientists? Are we really looking at much older, much newer scientists? Because this book series obviously grows out of the Oral History Project. You see a lot more of them are older generations of scientists. The People's Daily ongoing series is now moving much toward younger scientists. That's the blue there. The books are the red. You can also see, of course, a dip in the 1950s, which makes sense because that would be the generation that would not have had access to college education because of the Cultural Revolution. But besides that, you can sort of see the general distribution of the types of people that they're profiling here. And you think about the types of fields that are represented. Obviously, the main two are engineering and physics, which makes sense given the practical nature. Also, a lot of agricultural sciences, as well as an array of others. But these are the types of scientists that are considered embodying the spirit tend to fall into these general categories. And so at the heart of this campaign are 6 elements. We might call them ethos in the Mertonian sense, but sort of values that an ideal Chinese scientist should embody. So the first one, and it's important that it is the first one because it comes first in all of these lists, is patriotism. Again, this is very similar to the idea of redness as expressed earlier. It means going through all of these documents, it is the highest morality. It is about keeping China in people's hearts, serving the people vividly. But especially here is this link between the ambitions of the scientists and the ambitions of the country. So the individual motivation is very much tied in with the national motivation. They often use a phrase which is saying the needs of the country should come above those of the family, which is 国为重，家为轻. So the idea that the country comes first, the individual, personal, family needs come second. Similar to the idea of redness, the emphasis on patriotism is still a two-way street, right? By being patriotic, by being motivated by the right reasons, scientists will end up doing better science because they'll know where the bottlenecks are, they'll know the problems they need to be solving, they'll be thinking in the right ways. That will help them identify problems more easily and therefore do better science. There's also a sense of inheriting something from the older generations. So the older generations, such as the figures with their nice little cartoon caricatures here, were reviving China from its century of humiliation. The job of the current crop of scientists is to take that and make China a scientific superpower. The second characteristic is innovation. What they mean by innovation here is especially to be risk-taking, which is, in opposition to the idea of what we might call formalism or bureaucratism. They want scientists to take risks. They're going above and beyond what is already known, not limiting your research to already well-trod areas. And the idea here, again, is that to do something great requires not just following the rules, not just being a generic bureaucrat, but actually taking risk into your own hands and doing more to be on the cutting edge of these things. And many of the people that they profile in terms of innovation are people who've made sort of important groundbreaking discoveries, often even when they're told that this is out of the normal bounds doing it, they sort of stick to it and make important contributions. I highlight here that Qian is in this one. He's also in the previous one. He comes up a lot. And in many of these, they sort of one scientist embodies multiple characteristics of these. It's not a one-to-one situation. The third one is seeking truth, and we're back to Zhuke here. This is really about, this is similar to organized skepticism, about not blindly accepting authority, using the rigors of the scientific method. This is often contrasted to the idea of, non-scientific decision-making where you just use your impulses. Instead, this is really a commitment to the principles of good scientific research, rigorous methodology, careful work, direct experimentation close to the ground. You can see in this quote here, rigorous testing results with the scientific method, not blindly believing authority. There's in many ways, this idea of seeking truth is pretty similar to a Weberian ideal of the scientists actually doing their work, in the sense of when they're doing science, they have to be as objective as possible. They have to be only thinking about their work and persisting as much as possible in using the scientific method. There's also an anti-authoritarian overtone here, the idea that you should not just blindly accept authority. There's a bunch of quotes that say something to the extent of, I love my teachers, but I love the truth even more, right? In the idea that you shouldn't just listen to your teachers, you should actually adhere to the fundamental scientific spirit. The next one, dedication, is about a certain attitude of mind that involves patience, calmness, humility, selflessness. There's a lot of overlaps here between ideal sort of party cadres and the ideal scientists. One of the big phrases is sitting on the cold bench, which is to say that you have to be willing to be really patient, to be on the sidelines, kind of be marginalized in order to have some larger gain at the end. This is not, these are really long-term processes. You have to basically dedicate your whole life to this practice, and it may or may not work. It may or may not be remunerative. It may or may not give you anything. Many of the figures that they profile in this are people from the nuclear program who basically went into obscurity. They left their families. They were just seen as, they've been now portrayed as so selfless by saying, we're just going to help, we're going to sacrifice everything and do it all anonymously because it's a secret project. Because the science is not about getting credit for it. It's about being selfless in what you're doing. The fifth of these is collaboration. Again, this is very similar to the communalism of what we talked about with J.D. Bernal. But it's two elements. One is that obviously science only works when there's collaborative projects. And the second part of this is that science can and should be centrally planned. So it's working together. It's also working together under the auspices of the party. The unity and collaboration of this sort of very complicated different set of research groups, teams that need some sort of organization. Collaboration therefore requires both working horizontally and working vertically. Only by sort of having some sort of stronger central leadership can collaboration be possible. And what they profile here are not individuals, but they profile all these major projects like the atomic bomb project, these submersibles, these massive civil engineering projects. These are examples of, these are not individuals, these are depersonalized projects, but they require solidarity, cooperation, community. And the last one is education. So it's not just about the scientists themselves, it's about spreading this to their students and to society at large. Teachers are absolutely role models, and also the shapers of the next generation. Teachers should be strict. They should be rigorous. They should be intense. There's this idea that proper education should not be too light. Only sort of really rigorous education and really strict rules will create the next generation of scientists. And it's also about educating not just skills, but educating morality too, because this is all tied together. These teachers are, by being the role models, by embodying these values, they are passing on this spirit of science and not just the skills of science itself. And I'll just say two briefly other key values that come up here. One is curiosity. So the motivations that they're talking about are not just the motivations of the patriotism and the politics. They're also embracing the idea of scientific exploration being just the scientists being so excited and passionate about their work that they're going to want to be motivated by science. And I think this is actually an important shift from earlier periods of the communist views of science, because I think there was in previous times maybe more of a skepticism about non-political forms of motivation. I think this is a more broad-based approach where curiosity from the science itself is important. And as I mentioned in the education point, this is about not just teaching the next generation of scientists, but also about spreading science to society. And you want to create a society that respects knowledge, praises innovation, loves science, is dedicated to science. That is part of what will make science work. So the good scientist in sum here is somebody who's motivated to do good science, and that motivation comes from patriotism, it comes from curiosity. So it's both from the political motivation and the scientific motivation, capable of achieving new breakthroughs, right? With it, the science itself is has to be good. It has to be willing to listen to the party, which is especially obviously the patriotism, but also being humble and de-individuated, and willing to spread the values of science across society through education and sort of science popularization. So now I want to sort of wrap this up and try to put this in context with what we've talked about before. So if we think about the Chinese ideas here and the existing Mertonian values, I would argue that actually, so 3 of these 4 are embodied in this campaign. So universalism is a little complicated because this emphasis on patriotism, all of this seems like it's trying to create a non-universal science. But actually, I think that if we think about the sort of core values of what's being talked about here, the idea is that science itself can be universal, but the scientists should not be. And I think that when Xi Jinping talks about this famous phrase, science has no borders, but scientists have a motherland, this is really important. It's not just a sort of throwaway phrase. This is a really important phrase saying that we need to, like, science itself is an idea, but our goal is to cultivate scientists and their attitudes and promote that patriotism. That way they'll be motivated by the right reasons to do science in a universal way. So the conception here is not trying to make a non-universal science, but rather that what matters is how we cultivate and mold the scientists themselves. The communalism, obviously, there's lots of elements here that reflect science as a collaborative process. Organized skepticism, the idea of seeking truth is very much in line with that. But I think where it changes here is that this is a fundamental rejection of disinterestedness. So it's not that scientists should only be working for science. The scientists should be working for the party and the party's goals. And that this is not just any sort of person can become a scientist and anybody equal, that the institutions will regulate themselves, but rather that there has to be a cultivation of virtue of the scientists in order to have the proper achievement of science in society. So the spirit of science is very much something that must be shaped and cultivated. It is not something that is naturally occurring. Now, there's sort of two ways to think about this. I mean, there's the need for external disinterest. The party goals needs to have external guidance to shape, and also the need for internal cultivation. And I think that we can see this this idea that self-regulating systems are dangerous, and they need both internal cultivation of scientists and external guidance from the party in various ideas of what happens if science is left to its own devices. So there's an article in People's Daily that says, you know, the jewel in the crown of science is glittering, it's inspiring, but sometimes it may have the side effect of making people lose themselves. Without moral support, people commit hypocrisy and evil under the name of science, right? Without proper moral guidance, science left to its own devices will not regulate itself. It will actually potentially corrupt people, right? And going into the secondary literature, Donald Munro and his sort of idea of man in contemporary China says specialized knowledge not guided by proper moral principles is dangerous. So again, the moral principles that we're talking about here are both the party's external guidance and the sense of cultivating that virtue individually. And I want to sort of expand this out by saying that I think that the way to view this is that science and the way the party's doing science is in line with a general sense of a party skepticism about the possibility of institutions to self-regulate. And thus, again, you need a combination of party control and cultivation of social morality. I guess it was 1 or 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, there was a big discussion about the idea of the disorderly expansion of capital. Companies like Alibaba and Tencent were using their very strong, very large market share to create inventions that the party did not particularly like, that they didn't see as helping the public good. Capital was expanding in ways that the party did not agree with. That was considered disorderly. And of course, that led to a very strong crackdown on large tech companies, which were seen to be too large and using their large power in ways that didn't align with the goals of the party. And this reflects an idea that just left to their own devices, these institutions, whether it's capital, whether it's science, will not necessarily, will actually likely not work on behalf of the party goals. They are likely to go off in their own directions, which may well be bad for society. So the reason I think that this is interesting and important here is that, so we know, for example, that Xi Jinping is calling for big science, right? He's not saying we need to break up the science. He's saying we actually need, this is the era of big science. Science matters. It's going to be large. If it's going to be large, how do you then promote it without it running into the problem where you want to break it up and bring it down? And I think that that's part of why the answer here is that you need to have this sense of propaganda education about cultivating the right virtues as one of the important characteristics of potentially solving this need for large scientific systems, but being skeptical of the ability of self-regulation. So summing up here a little bit, also we see is in all of these different views, there's definitely a reflection between the political and social orders and this sort of spirit of science. We should think about the way that we do this not as an either or, that it is a top-down system or a bottom-up system, or it is a, there's some sort of communist or non-communist version, but rather that the component parts of the spirit of science can be broken out and we can see where those overlaps are. So for example, in this case, I think that we do see some elements, some ways in which the Chinese system does reflect some of the key Mertonian or Weberian, or however we're going to put it, key attitudes of science, but not all of them. And the key that I want to point out is disinterestedness is really the one that the party rejects. When we're thinking about the party's attempt to then cultivate science and cultivate a spirit of science, I think we need to, they're very aware that political control is hard, that political control risks overly constraining the practice of science. And I think that the only way to square the circle, the easiest way to square the circle, is to think about both sides, both creating these, the right rules and regulations, but also really emphasizing the need for cultivating scientists' virtue, and the sort of propaganda education campaigns are supposed to be a part of that. I don't think that we obviously see reflections of the original communist ideas, but I don't think we're going back to an idea of Lysenkoism again. I think much more likely we should think about this as, again, part of these interregnum periods where, like the 1960s, where they have not given up on the idea of redness. Redness is still very important, but that is coupled with the idea that science must do its own thing. How do we let science do what it does while shaping it from the inside? Anyway, so that is my presentation today. I hope that at the very least it sparked some discussion. Thank you so much for your time, and I really look forward to your feedback.
Thanks so much, Josh. This was a most comprehensive and super fascinating presentation with so many different parts and so much food for thought. And I'm sure we'll have a quite intense debate to which everyone is invited